We all prefer things a certain way, like groceries. If you want groceries just how you like them, you gotta try Instacart. They have a new preference picker that lets you pick how ripe or unripe you want your bananas. Shoppers can see your preferences up front, helping guide their choices. Because when it comes to groceries, the details matter. Instacart. Get groceries just how you like.
In 1966, a small town in West Virginia was terrorized by a monster for 13 months. But what led up to this event started centuries ago. Join us today as we go deep into one of West Virginia's and the world's most famous cryptid encounters ever. We're talking, of course, about the Mothman. Welcome back to Paranormal Directive 13, your weekly paranormal podcast with me, your host Matt, where every week we deep dive into another paranormal case and really go through every detail in exploring what happened, when, and who it happened to. This week, we're going back to 1966 to Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where for 13 months, a creature with glowing red eyes terrorized the town, all culminating in a disastrous bridge collapse that claimed 46 lives. But before we dive into the creature with the glowing red eyes, before we explore those months of terror that gripped this small river town, we need to understand something crucial. This isn't just a story about a monster. This is a story about a land soaked in blood and injustice that kind of echoed across generations, and about how trauma became mythology and how that mythology becomes truth. This is the story of the Mothman, and I am so excited for this episode. The Mothman is by far my favorite cryptid of all time. And this story is so deep and so detailed, and there's so much stuff that happened before and after and in between. There's just all these crazy different twists and turns between Men in Black and Indrid Cold and UFO sightings and other disasters. And then there's the curse and history behind the town before everything. It's just this perfect mixture of paranormal and just folklore, and it's just a great story. So like I said, before we start talking about the Mothman, we need to go back to before the American Revolution, because the story starts with the curse of Cornstalk. So the land itself, now called Point Pleasant, it sits at the kind of confluence of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers. It's a location that's drawn human settlement for over 1,000 years just because of how well it sits between these two rivers and access and all that. Archaeological evidence shows that the region was home to the Adena culture, the Hopewell tradition, and later the Fort Ancient peoples. They were all sophisticated societies who built these elaborate earthworks and burial mounds all throughout this Ohio River Valley. But the most significant sites of these was Tuendewe, which is a Wyandot name meaning the point between two waters. And for centuries, this location served as kind of a natural, neutral meeting ground for multiple tribes, the Shawnee, the Cherokee, the Delaware, and other tribes as well. It's considered a sacred place, a place where different people could gather for trade, diplomacy, and ceremony without any fear of violence. And more than just a meeting place, Tuendewe is considered through tribal oral history as what they call a thin place, which is like a location where the barrier between the physical and spirit worlds was kind of a little more permeable than other spots. The indigenous people would speak of strange lights and unusual animal behavior and spiritual manifestations in this area. They developed elaborate rituals and protocols for interacting with these things in this place. By the 1770s, the American colonial frontier had reached into this Ohio River Valley, and with it became inevitable conflict. The indigenous people who had managed this land for generations through this complex system of seasonal migration and agreements, found themselves facing an entirely different kind of expansion. It was one that did not seek coexistence, but complete displacement. And here enters Chief Cornstalk, whose Shawnee name was Hokalesqua, meaning stalk of corn, which is where the name Cornstalk comes from. It was a name that reflected both his tall, imposing stature and a role as a provider for his people. Born somewhere around 1720, Cornstalk was more than just a war chief. He was a diplomat and a strategist, and ultimately he was a tragic figure who would desperately try to navigate between just two incompatible views between the American settlers and the indigenous tribes in the area. And we need to understand, the Shawnee worldview of this place. They didn't see land as property to be owned, but as a living entity to be stewarded. Their migration patterns followed seasonal cycles and had been established for generations. And the idea of permanent settlements or boundaries drawn on maps of exclusive ownership, these were not just foreign, but they were fundamentally contradictory to their understanding of how humans should relate to the world. But the American colonists, they had a different vision. They had one of a permanent settlement, agricultural transformation, territorial expansion. They weren't just different approaches to land use. They were completely incompatible ideas, different ways of understanding humanity's place in the universe. By 1774, tensions had reached a breaking point. Virginia's Governor Lord Dunmore had promised land grants to veterans of the French and Indian War, land that was already inhabited by the Shawnee tribes. The surveyors and settlers began pushing across the Ohio River, directly violating the existing treaties that we had in place. And the Shawnee, led by Cornstalk, faced an impossible choice: either accept this continued encroachment and the gradual destruction of their way of life, or fight back and face the full military of the Virginia colony. Cornstalk chose to fight, but he did so with, a heavy heart, knowing that victory was unlikely and that his people were going to pay a terrible price regardless of whether they won or lost. And the Battle of Point Pleasant, as it came to be known, wasn't just a military engagement. It was this collision between two completely different ways of understanding the world. The Virginians saw it as a necessary step in civilizing the frontier, and the Shawnee saw it as a desperate attempt to preserve not just their lives, but their entire way of being. On October 10th, 1774, at dawn, Colonel Andrew Lewis had assembled what he called the Army of Virginia, which was approximately 1,100 militiamen drawn from various counties. And they weren't professional soldiers, but farmers, tradesmen, frontiersmen who had volunteered or been conscripted into this campaign. On the opposite side, Cornstalk had managed to assemble his confederation of warriors from multiple tribes, mostly Shawnee, but also Delaware, Mingo, and a few Cherokee. His force was only about 300 to 500 warriors, but these were experienced fighters who intimately knew the terrain, even though they were vastly outnumbered. Now, to really set a picture of the battlefield in Point Pleasant, it was a triangular piece of land bounded by the Ohio River to the northwest and the Kanawha River to the southwest, and dense forest covered most of the area, with this thick brush that limited visibility to just a few yards. The terrain favored defenders and guerrilla tactics rather than traditional European-style warfare. Similar to how we were able to win the American Revolution, we went into guerrilla warfare tactics as opposed to just the traditional straight line up and shoot. Cornstalk's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He planned to attack at dawn using the forest cover to negate the Virginians' numerical advantage. His warriors would strike hard and fast, then melt back into the woods before the colonists could organize a response. The battle began around sunrise when two colonists, James Robertson and Valentine Sevier, encountered a group of Shawnee warriors while checking their hunting traps. The first shots were fired, and within minutes, the entire forest erupted in violence. Cornstalk himself was this towering presence on the battlefield. Contemporary accounts describe him as over 6 feet tall, which was very tall for that era, and a voice that could be heard above the sounds and chaos of battle. Witnesses reported that he moved through the fighting kind of like a force of nature, rallying his warriors, coordinating attacks, and personally engaging in hand-to-hand combat. One particular account recorded later by a Virginia militiaman named John Stewart described his encounter with Cornstalk that haunted him for the rest of his life. And he wrote, "I saw the great chief himself, tall as a pine tree, his face painted for war, moving through the smoke like he was dancing with death itself. His eyes, I'll never forget his eyes. They seemed to burn with something more than anger. It was like he was looking through this world into some other place entirely." The battle raged on for nearly 6 hours, and as the morning wore on, the Shawnees' initial advantage began to disappear. Their ammunition was running low, and despite their superior knowledge of the terrain, they were just simply outnumbered more than 2 to 1. By noon, Cornstalk had realized that victory was impossible, but rather than ordering a general retreat, he made a decision that would go on to echo through the centuries. He called his warriors together and spoke words that survivors would remember and pass down through generations. He said, "Brothers, the Great Spirit has shown me that our time here is ending, but let our ending be worthy of our beginning. Let us show these invaders what it means to die as Shawnee." When the smoke cleared, the casualties were staggering for an engagement of this size. The Shawnee had lost at least 41 warriors, and the Virginia militia lost 75 men and 140 were wounded. Casualty rates that would have been considered catastrophic in European warfare. But for the survivors, the victory kind of felt hollow. They had witnessed something in that forest that went beyond normal military engagement. They had seen men fight with this desperate courage that kind of transcended their rational calculation of war. And in the aftermath of Point Pleasant, Cornstalk did something extraordinary. Despite the loss, despite watching his son die, and despite seeing his warriors slaughtered, he chose peace. The Treaty of Camp Charlotte, signed on October 19, 1774, established the Ohio River as a boundary between white settlement and indigenous territory. But what makes Cornstalk's decision more remarkable is he could have easily chosen vengeance. He could have allied with the British during the Revolutionary War and potentially driven the American colonists back across the Appalachian Mountains, when instead he honored the treaty even when it came clear that the Americans had no intention of honoring their side. And this now brings us to one of the more shameful episodes in early American history. And it's an event that would allegedly give birth to the curse that haunts Point Pleasant to this day. By 1777, the Revolutionary War was raging, and both the Americans and British were desperately trying to secure Native American allies. The British promised to restore indigenous lands if they would fight against the Americans, and it would have been the perfect opportunity for Cornstalk to seek revenge for Point Pleasant. But instead, he chose neutrality, and more than that, he actively worked to prevent other tribes from joining the British. In September 1777, he traveled to Fort Randolph, built on the very site of where the Battle of Point Pleasant had been fought, to warn American commanders of planned British Allied attacks. So Cornstalk was walking into a military installation built by the very people who had killed his son and his warriors, and he was offering intelligence that could save American lives, expecting nothing in return but continued peace. And the fort commander, Captain Matthew Arbuckle, should have thanked Cornstalk and allowed him to leave safely. But instead, he made a decision that would reverberate through centuries. He took Cornstalk hostage, along with his other son and another Shawnee leader named Red Hawk. And for weeks, Cornstalk remained imprisoned in Fort Randolph. Contemporary accounts describe him as maintaining his dignity despite the circumstances, spending his days in quiet meditation and his evenings sharing stories and songs with his fellow prisoners. Soldiers at the fort reported that there was something almost otherworldly about his presence. Just a sense of power barely contained of forces beyond normal human understanding, held in check only by Cornstalk's own will. And on November 10, 1777, everything went wrong. A party of unknown Native Americans attacked and killed a soldier named Robert Gilmore outside of the fort. The exact identity of these attackers was never determined. They might have been Shawnee, but they could have just as easily have been from any of a dozen other tribes, or even British Allied forces trying to destabilize the region. But to the garrison of Fort Randolph, it didn't matter. They had Native Americans in custody, and someone had to pay. What happened next was pure murder. An armed mob of soldiers broke into the makeshift prison where Cornstalk and his companions were being held. There was no trial, no attempt to determine guilt or innocence, no military protocol, just violence born of fear and rage. The first shots killed Red Hawk instantly. Ellen Ipsico, Cornstalk's son, tried to shield his father but was cut down by multiple musket balls, and Cornstalk himself stood tall, facing his killers without flinching. According to witnesses, he spoke no words of anger or hatred, and instead he began what sounded like a prayer or chant in Shawnee. Captain Arbuckle arrived just as the shooting ended, finding Cornstalk's body riddled with bullets. Some say as many as 8 musket shots. But witnesses reported something strange about the scene. Despite the violence, despite the chaos, Cornstalk's face appeared peaceful, almost serene. And his eyes, they said, remained open, staring not at his killers, but at something beyond them, like something only he could see. And then, according to multiple witness accounts recorded in military reports and personal letters, something impossible happened. As Cornstalk's life ebbed away, his lips began to move, and the words that emerged were in Shawnee, but several witnesses who understood the language translated them later. The exact wording varies between accounts, but the overall meaning is consistent. And he said, "By my death, I call upon the Great Spirit to bring darkness to this place. Let no structure built here stand. Let no venture prosper. Let the waters rise to claim what blood is cursed. For 200 years, let the children of those who did this evil know fear as my people have known fear." The aftermath of Cornstalk's murder sent shockwaves through both the indigenous and colonial communities, and even frontier leaders who had supported aggressive policies against Native Americans recognized that murdering a peace chief under a flag of truce was a catastrophic breach of honor. Thomas Jefferson, then the governor of Virginia, ordered a full investigation, and he wrote to the Virginia legislature, "The murder of Cornstalk will bring upon us a long and expensive war." George Washington himself condemned the killing, recognizing that it would make future negotiations with indigenous people nearly impossible. But the damage was done, and within months, Shawnee war parties were crossing the Ohio River in numbers that had not been seen since before the Battle of Point Pleasant. The fragile peace that Cornstalk had maintained through sheer force of will collapsed completely. More disturbing were the reports coming in from Fort Randolph itself. Soldiers began reporting strange occurrences almost immediately after Cornstalk's death. Sentries spoke of seeing a tall figure walking the battlements at night, visible only as like this dark silhouette against the stars. Others reported hearing singing or chanting in an unknown language coming from the spot where Cornstalk had died. The fort's blacksmith, a man named Joshua Peters, wrote to his brother in Richmond, "Something ain't right here since the chief was killed. The horses won't settle and the dogs won't stop howling after dark. 3 men have asked for transfers and I'm thinking of joining them. There's a feeling in the air like before a thunderstorm, but no storm ever comes." And here's where the story begins to move from history into legend. Over the next 2 centuries, Point Pleasant would be struck by an extraordinary series of disasters, far more than statistical probability would suggest for a community of its size. And I'm going to walk you through some of these incidents because understanding this pattern is crucial to comprehending what happened in 1966. In 1880 was the Great Fire of Point Pleasant. The blaze started in a downtown business district and spread rapidly through the wooden buildings. By the time it was contained, nearly half the town had been destroyed. The fire began, according to witnesses, in the basement of a building constructed directly over part of the original Fort Randolph foundations. In 1903, the Ohio River flood. While flooding was common along the Ohio River, this particular flood was unprecedented in its intensity and it seemed to target Point Pleasant specifically. Waters rose to levels not seen in recorded history, forcing the evacuation of nearly the entire town. And when the waters receded, they had destroyed most of the remaining structures from the 19th century. And then in 1918, the influenza pandemic hit Point Pleasant harder than surrounding communities. Despite having no major transportation hubs or large gatherings that might explain the spread, the town suffered a mortality rate nearly 3 times the national average. In 1937, there was another catastrophic flood, this time accompanied by unusual circumstances. Witnesses reported that the floodwaters seemed to flow in patterns that defied the natural topography, creating eddies and currents that made no hydrological sense. Several rescue workers reported seeing lights under the water and hearing what sounded like voices calling from beneath the surface. And then in 1942, a train derailment involving hazardous military chemicals occurred just outside of Point Pleasant. The train was carrying materials for the war effort, including experimental compounds, whose exact nature still remains classified to this day, but the derailment resulted in a toxic cloud that forced the evacuation of the town for nearly a week. So by the 1960s, Point Pleasant existed in a unique psychological space. This was a community that had experienced repeated trauma across multiple generations. The curse of Chief Cornstalk wasn't just folklore, it was a living part of the community's memory, and a lens through which residents interpreted every misfortune, every strange occurrence, and every unexplained event. This psychological priming is crucial to understanding what happened in 1966. When the impossible began to manifest, community already had a framework for interpreting it. The curse provided context, meaning, and most importantly, expectation. But there was something else happening in the 1960s that made Point Pleasant particularly susceptible to paranormal activity. The town was undergoing rapid social and economic change, and the traditional industries that had sustained the community for generations were declining. Young people were leaving for opportunities in larger cities, and the social structures that had provided stability and meaning were beginning to fracture. In anthropological terms, Point Pleasant in 1966 was experiencing what researchers call cultural trauma, which is a collective wound that affects an entire community's sense of identity and a place in the world. And according to numerous studies in paranormal research, periods of cultural trauma are often associated with increased reports of supernatural phenomena. So by November 1966, Point Pleasant was a community defined by historical trauma, ongoing cultural stress, and a collective belief system that expected supernatural manifestations. The land itself carried the weight of centuries of violence and injustice, and the population was psychologically primed to interpret unusual events through a paranormal lens. All of the elements were in place for something extraordinary to happen. All that was needed was for a catalyst, some event or entity that would trigger these latent forces that had been building for nearly 2 centuries. And that catalyst was about to arrive. So here we are. It's November 1966 in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. This is a classic small American town, about 5,000 people tucked along the Ohio River, and this wasn't some tourist trap or a place where weird stuff happened regularly. These were practical folks, farmers, factory workers, shop owners, the kind of people whose biggest excitement was usually Friday night football games. And we got to understand who we're dealing with here. Roger Scarberry, one of our main witnesses, was just 18 years old. He was newly married, working at the chemical plant, and his wife Linda was 17, basically still a kid herself, fresh out of high school. Their friends Steve and Mary Millette were basically the same type of people. These weren't the type of people who went looking for trouble or made up wild stories for attention. These were just young people doing what young people do. They were driving around on a Tuesday night, probably looking for somewhere quiet to park and talk. But here's the thing that makes this whole story so compelling is that the Mothman didn't just suddenly appear out of nowhere on November 15th. There were signs, weird little incidents that most people brushed off at the time, but make perfect sense when you look back. Let me tell you what happened 5 days earlier in Clendenin, about 40 miles southeast of Point Pleasant. Now, this is a part of the story that often gets left out because it was reported later. These guys reported this after things started happening, but they actually had this experience on November 10th. Just around dusk, 5 guys were finishing up their work at a small cemetery. And these weren't kids. We're talking about grown men in their 20s through 50s. Kenneth Duncan, Ernest Rowe, Okie Harris, Charles Bennett, and Daniel Wamsley. All steady workers, all familiar with cemeteries where shadows can play tricks on you, but what they saw wasn't a trick. Kenneth Duncan described it as a brown human being with wings, flying low through the trees above their heads. And think about that for a second. You have 5 grown men all seeing the same thing. And what gets me about this incident is these guys didn't come forward right away. They didn't run to the newspapers or call the sheriff. They went home, probably had a beer, and tried to convince themselves that they'd all been seeing things. It was only after the big Mothman encounter made headlines that they found the courage to speak up. And Ernest Rowe put it perfectly. We wouldn't have said nothing about it, but when we heard about them other people seeing it, well, we figured we better speak up. Ain't none of us the type to make up stories, and we all saw the same thing. So that reluctance to come forward, that's what makes their testimony so credible. These weren't attention seekers. They were embarrassed about what they had seen. But then it gets a little weirder, and this is a part of the story that we've talked about now for the past 2 weeks on the show, which was on November 2nd, 1966, Woody Derenberger meeting Indrid Cold. And for those of you who haven't listened to the Indrid Cold episodes, I'm going to just do a quick rundown of it, but I do suggest going back and listening to those so that you can get the full detail of that story. But essentially, in a nutshell, Woody Derenberger was driving home on Interstate 77 just south of Parkersburg. This was a 54-year-old traveling salesman, a family man with 3 kids, someone whose living depended on being reliable and trustworthy, not the type to make up wild stories. And at exactly 7:30 p.m., and Woody was always precise about that time, his routine drive home turned into something that would haunt him forever. A strange vehicle pulled up directly in front of his truck, forcing him to slow down, but this wasn't any kind of vehicle he'd ever seen. He described it as metallic, shaped like an old-fashioned chimney, about 30 feet long, and here's the kicker, is that it was hovering about 1 foot off the highway. Not flying, not rolling, hovering. And remember, in 1966, UFO sightings were all over the news, but people were describing the classic flying saucers. Disc-shaped, spinning, covered in lights, and what Woody saw was nothing like the typical UFO reports at the time. It was unique and specific and completely unlike anything in popular culture. And out of this craft stepped a man. And Woody was very clear about this. It was a man, not an alien or a monster. He was about 6 feet tall, well-dressed in some dark, shimmery fabric. He had a dark tan, he had black, slick-back hair. Everything about him was immaculate, almost unnaturally perfect. This man, who introduced himself as Indrid Cold, started talking, but not with his mouth. The words just appeared directly in Woody's head, like he was broadcasting into his mind. He was speaking to him telepathically. And the conversation was kind of bizarrely mundane for something so crazy. Cold asked basic questions. What's your name? Tell me about this area. What kind of work do you do? Like he was conducting some kind of survey. The whole thing only lasted about 10 minutes. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. Cold telepathically said to Woody, "I shall see you again," got back in his craft, and disappeared into the night sky. And there is much more to the Indrid Cold story, but that's just a brief overview of what happened. And you might wonder what this has to do with the Mothman, and that's a fair question. On the surface, they seem like completely different phenomena. One's a relatively peaceful contact experience, and the other is this terrifying encounter with a winged monster. But researchers like John Keel figured out that these weren't separate incidents. They were all part of something bigger happening in the Ohio River Valley. The Indrid Cold encounter established some important patterns. First, it proved something genuinely weird was going on in the region weeks before the Mothman sightings. Second, it involved telepathic communication, something that would come up again and again in these Mothman encounters. And third, Cold seemed to be gathering information about the local community, kind of like he was doing some kind of reconnaissance mission. So that brings us to November 15th, 1966, the night that put Point Pleasant on the map for all the wrong reasons. It was a Tuesday, and it was unusually warm for mid-November in West Virginia. Roger and Linda Scarberry, who we mentioned earlier, had been married for just 5 months, and they decided to go on a drive with their friends Steve and Mary Millette. Nothing unusual about that, just two young couples doing what young couples do. And they ended up at what they call the TNT Area, which is about 7 miles north of Point Pleasant. During World War II, this had been a massive munitions manufacturing and storage site. There was thousands of workers round-the-clock production, and by 1966, it had been abandoned for over 20 years, leaving behind this kind of eerie, creepy landscape of concrete bunkers scattered across almost 3,000 acres. So picture it, there's dozens of these igloo-shaped concrete bunkers built to contain massive explosions. Their walls were several feet thick, metal doors rusted and warped, vegetation growing up through the cracks in the pavement, creating this kind of post-apocalyptic atmosphere. It's very similar to what you think of when you think you find like an old abandoned military bunker. It's almost the exact picture that I can imagine you're picturing in your head right now. Local teenagers would sometimes party out there, but most people avoided it. The place just kind of felt off even in the daylight. At around 11:30 p.m., the two couples were driving through the area in Roger's 1957 Chevy, just killing time when Linda spotted something behind an old abandoned car near what they called the generator plant. "Stop," she called out. "Look at that." In the beam of their headlights crouched a figure that really shouldn't exist. It was roughly humanoid, but it was wrong in almost every detail. It was 6 to 7 feet tall with an impossibly broad, muscular torso. Its skin looked gray or brownish gray, with a texture Linda described later as like leather but smooth. But it had these wings. Folded against its back, they were enormous, easily 10 feet from tip to tip. They didn't look like bird wings or bat wings, but something entirely unique and leathery and kind of anatomically impossible for a creature that size to have. And its eyes were two large circular orbs that glowed with their own like internal light, not reflecting the headlights, but actually producing their own luminescence. Roger described them as like bicycle reflectors, but bigger and brighter, and they glowed red like brake lights. Linda was more visceral about her description, said they were hypnotic. I couldn't look away. It was like they were looking right through me, right into my soul. And that kind of sounds like the description of the Dover Demon's eyes, just glowing on their own and having this weird, like piercing light to them, like they were looking right through you. And for what felt like forever, but was really probably only a couple seconds, the four young people and this creature just stared at each other. The thing didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just looked at them with those glowing eyes. Linda insisted there was some sort of intelligence there, not the blank stare of an animal, but like a calculating gaze of something that was thinking and evaluating and maybe kind of deciding what to do about them. And then it rose straight up into the air, not like a bird taking off with a running start, but straight up vertically, like gravity had just stopped affecting it. The wings spread to their full impossible span, and it just hung there for a minute against the stars. And that's when Roger's nerve broke. He threw the car in reverse, spun around, and floored it toward the main road. The speedometer climbed 60, 70, 80 miles per hour. But when they looked up, the creature was right there, pacing them effortlessly. And this is the part that kind of gets me with this encounter, is Steve Mallett watched the speedometer hit 100 miles per hour as Roger desperately tried to outrun this thing. but the creature kept pace without breaking a sweat. Its wings weren't flapping frantically like a bird trying to maintain speed. They moved with slow, deliberate strokes, almost lazy-like it was barely even trying. It was like it was playing with us, Mary Millette said later. Like it could have caught us anytime it wanted to, but it was just following, watching. The thing stayed with them for about 1.5 miles, just outside of the reach of their headlights, but clearly visible. And then, as they approached the junction with Route 62, it simply veered away and disappeared into the darkness. And the four of them didn't stop until they reached the Mason County Sheriff's Office in Point Pleasant. Their hearts pounding, their minds reeling, all talking at once in their desperation to be believed. Deputy Millard Halstead was on duty that night. A steady, no-nonsense guy who'd seen his share of weird situations in rural West Virginia, but nothing prepared him for the story these people were about to tell him. And what struck him immediately was their obvious terror. They were scared to death, Halstead recalled later. I've been in law enforcement for 12 years, and you learn to tell when someone's putting you on. These kids weren't lying. They'd seen something that scared them bad. Halstead took their statement carefully, noting how consistent their descriptions were despite their emotional state. All four agreed on the basics: the creature's size, its wings, those glowing red eyes, and its impossible ability to keep pace with a car doing 100 miles per hour. There were minor variations, but that actually made their story a little bit more credible. If they'd been making it up, their accounts would probably have been identical to a T. The deputy decided to investigate. He and Deputy Ray Schiffer drove out to the TNT area to look for evidence. They found the abandoned car where the creature had first been spotted, but no signs of disturbance. No physical evidence that anything had happened. And Roger had mentioned to the deputies that he saw a dead dog while he was speeding away on the side of the road, and they also couldn't find the dog that Roger was certain that he had seen near the generator plant. Just one of the little small mysteries that would never be explained. And by morning, word had reached Mary Heyer. She was a local correspondent for the Athens Messenger. And Heyer was a respected journalist known for her careful fact-checking and skeptical approach. She interviewed the witnesses separately, looking for inconsistencies that might indicate a hoax. And what she found convinced her that something extraordinary had occurred. I've interviewed these kids extensively, she wrote. They're not the type to make up stories, and their accounts are remarkably consistent. Roger Scarberry in particular is a steady young man, not given to flights of fancy. If he says he saw it, I believe he saw something. Heyer's story ran on November 16th, under the headline, Couples See Man-Sized Bird Creature. But it was a reporter from the Charleston Gazette who would give the creature the name that would make it famous. Inspired by the Batman villain killer Moth, he dubbed it Mothman, and the name stuck immediately. And the story went national fast. The Associated Press picked it up, and within days, newspapers across the country were running with headlines about Point Pleasant's strange creature. The Mothman was born, and with it came the transformation of a quiet river town into the epicenter of one of America's most enduring mysteries. And in the days following the Scarberry-Millette encounter, Point Pleasant transformed overnight. The newspaper coverage had spread the story nationwide, but it wasn't just outside attention that was changing the community. It was a growing realization that the thing with the glowing red eyes hadn't left. It was still there, still watching, still showing up in ways that made everyone question what they thought they knew about reality. Mary Heyer's phone at the Athens Messenger started ringing constantly. As a reporter who'd broken the story, she became the unofficial collector of Mothman reports. The calls weren't coming from attention seekers or publicity hounds. They were coming from the same solid, working-class people who'd been living quietly in Point Pleasant for generations. I knew most of these people personally. They were my neighbors, people I'd gone to church with, people whose families I'd known for years. These weren't the kind of folks who made up stories or sought attention. They were scared, genuinely scared, and they were seeing things that didn't make sense. The number of reports was staggering. In just 3 days after the initial story, Heyer documented 8 more sightings, each one adding new pieces to this growing puzzle. But these weren't random encounters. Patterns were emerging that suggested whatever was happening in Point Pleasant was far more complex than just one creature showing up occasionally. November 16th brought another terrifying encounter. Marcella Bennett was driving with her friends Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Wamsley near the TNT area around 9 p.m. She wasn't some thrill seeker looking for the Mothman. Bennett was a practical woman in her 40s, a mother who was just returning from a social visit. But as they passed the abandoned bunkers, they saw something that would change her life forever. It was lying down behind a parked car, Bennett had told investigators later, her voice still shaking as she was reporting this. At first, I thought it might be a person who was hurt or something. But when our headlights hit it, it started to rise up, and that's when I realized it wasn't human at all. The creature rose from the ground in a motion Bennett described as fluid, like it was made of liquid instead of flesh and bone. And standing up, it towered over the abandoned car, those massive wings folded against its back like a cape, making it seem even larger and more imposing. They were like headlights, she said about the eyes, but red instead of white, and they seemed to look right through you. I felt like it was reading my mind, like it knew everything about me just by looking at me. Raymond Wamsley floored it toward town, but the creature followed them, not running or walking, flying alongside the car with those enormous wings barely moving. It stayed with them for several miles, sometimes directly overhead, sometimes off to the side, always maintaining the same distance, always watching. When they finally reached Bennett's house, the terror continued. As they sat in the car trying to calm down and figure out what to do, the creature landed on Bennett's front porch. It walked up to the living room window and peered inside, its face pressed against the glass and those glowing eyes scanning the interior. Bennett's infant daughter was inside with a babysitter, and the thought of that thing being so close to her child sent her into a panic. But before she could decide whether to run inside or drive away, the creature just straightened up, spread its wings, and flew off into the night. This encounter added crucial elements to the Mothman story. First, it showed the creature wasn't limited to the TNT area. They would follow people home, invade their personal spaces. And second, it seemed curious about human domestic life, peering through windows like it was trying to understand how people lived. And third, it kept showing up around children, which became increasingly significant as more reports came in. And that same night, volunteer firemen on routine patrol reported seeing a large bird with red eyes flying over the Ohio River. And these were experienced outdoorsmen who knew local wildlife, but they couldn't identify what they'd seen. Fire Chief Bud McDaniel filed an official report describing an unidentified flying creature of unusual size and appearance. November 17th brought multiple reports from different parts of Mason County. Around 10:30 p.m., Richard West was driving home from work when he encountered the creature on Route 62, about 5 miles from Point Pleasant. West was a 37-year-old construction worker, practical as they come, not someone given to these flights of fancy. That is a common theme with these witnesses. It was standing in the middle of the road, just standing there like it owned the place. When my headlights hit it, those eyes lit up like Christmas tree lights. It was taller than any man I've ever seen, and those wings, Lord have mercy, those wings were huge. West slowed his truck to a crawl, unsure of whether to try going around the thing or turning back, and as he watched, the creature tilted its head in what seemed like curiosity or maybe recognition, and then, without any apparent effort, it rose straight up and disappeared over the treetops. And the thing that got me, Wes remembered, was how intelligent it looked. This wasn't some dumb animal. It was thinking, deciding what to do about me being there. And that's what scared me the most. But perhaps the most important early sighting happened on November 18th involving Connie Carpenter, an 18-year-old who worked at a local department store. Carpenter's experience was different from the others. It was prolonged, intensely personal, and it introduced an element that would become central to the entire Mothman situation. She'd first noticed the creature while driving through a residential area on the outskirts of Point Pleasant around 10:45 p.m. It was flying parallel to her car about 50 feet away and 30 feet up. At first I thought it might be a large bird, Carpenter said, but birds don't fly like that, so smooth and controlled with barely any wing movement. And when it turned to look at me, I saw those eyes, and I knew it wasn't any kind of bird I'd ever heard of. The creature paced her car for several blocks, maintaining the same distance and altitude, moving so smoothly it seemed to defy physics. Carpenter found herself unable to look away despite her terror. There was something hypnotic about its flight that commanded attention, even as every instinct tells you to run. And then the creature did something that elevated this encounter from just frightening to genuinely supernatural. And it communicated with her, not through spoken words, but directly into her mind in a way that Carpenter really struggled to describe. She said it wasn't like hearing a voice. It was more like thoughts that weren't my thoughts, ideas that appeared in my head that I knew weren't coming from me. It was trying to tell me something important, but I couldn't understand what it meant. The telepathic communication lasted about 2 minutes, during which Carpenter experienced a flood of images and sensations that seemed to relate to water, to danger, to something terrible happening to many people at once. The images were just chaotic and frightening, filled with urgency and impending doom that she couldn't really translate into specific warnings. And then, as suddenly as it began, the communication stopped. The creature veered away and disappeared, leaving her alone with these images still echoing in her mind. And when people think about small-town reporters, they probably picture someone covering church bake sales and high school football game, but Mary Hyre was nothing like that stereotype. This woman had been working as a journalist for over 20 years, covering everything from political scandals to natural disasters. She had seen it all, and more importantly, she could spot a fake story from miles away. So when Mary started documenting what was happening in Point Pleasant, you have to understand, this wasn't some gullible small-town reporter getting swept up in this hysteria. This was a seasoned professional who knew how to investigate, how to cross-reference stories, how to separate fact from fiction. And what she found scared the hell out of her. And Mary didn't just write down what these people had told her. She did the work. She interviewed witnesses separately to check if their stories matched up. She examined physical evidence. She talked to family members, local authorities, anyone who might shed light on what was really going on. And after months of this methodical investigation, she reached the conclusion that she really didn't want to reach. That something genuinely weird was happening in Point Pleasant, something that couldn't be explained away. And the electromagnetic disturbances were probably the most concrete and measurable part of this whole situation. And we're not talking about one or two isolated incidents that can be written off as coincidence. This was widespread, consistent, and absolutely baffling to just anyone who knew anything about electronics. Television sets all over Point Pleasant started malfunctioning in ways that made no technical sense. So here's what would happen. You'd be watching TV, and suddenly this piercing buzz would start coming from inside the set itself. Then the picture would start to distort or just cut out completely. So naturally, people would call repair technicians, but here's the weird part. When Tom Urey, the local electronics repair guy, would take these TVs back to his shop, they worked perfectly. He'd test everything, replace tubes, check all the connections, adjust the antennas, everything was fine. But the moment he'd return the TV to someone's house in Point Pleasant, the problems would start up again. Tom kept detailed records, and Mary reviewed them later. Between November 1966 and February 1967, he got 67 service calls related to unexplained TV interference. And this guy had been fixing TVs for 15 years. He'd never seen anything like it. These sets tested perfectly in every possible way, but they just wouldn't work right in certain houses on certain streets. It was like something in the air itself was messing with the signals. But it wasn't just TVs. Radio reception became equally messed up, with AM stations fading in and out randomly, and sometimes these mysterious signals would just completely overwhelm local broadcasts. And the phone lines started to have their own problems as well. Conversations would be interrupted by strange humming sounds, or people would report hearing like these faint voices speaking in an unknown language, kind of bleeding in from other calls. And Dr. Robert Smith, an electrical engineer from West Virginia University, came down to investigate at Mary's request. And what he found troubled him deeply. The interference patterns didn't match anything in the textbooks. If this was caused by atmospheric conditions, military testing, or industrial equipment, they should have been able to identify the source and predict when it would happen. But it was completely random, affecting some locations while leaving others, sometimes just right across the street, completely unaffected. And the electromagnetic stuff was unsettling enough, but it was just the foundation for something much more disturbing. Mary, with that instinct for patterns, started tracking a series of animal disappearances and mutilations that began plaguing the region. Dogs were the main victims, particularly larger breeds that should have been able to defend themselves. On November 15th, the same night as Roger and Linda Scarberry sighting, around 10:30 p.m., Newell Partridge, a local building contractor who lived in Salem, which is about 90 miles from Point Pleasant, was watching television when the screen suddenly went dark. He stated that a weird pattern filled the screen, and then he heard a loud whining sound from outside that raised in pitch and then ceased. He said it sounded like a generator winding up. Partridge's dog, Bandit, began to howl out on the front porch, and Newell went out to see what was going on. When he walked outside, he saw Bandit facing the hay barn, about 150 yards away from the house. Confused, Partridge turned on a flashlight in that direction and spotted two red circles that looked like eyes or bicycle reflectors. They were moving red orbs, and to him, they certainly weren't animal eyes, and they really scared the crap out of him. Bandit, who was an experienced hunting dog and protective of his territory, shot off across the yard in pursuit of the glowing eyes. Partridge called for him to stop, but the animal paid no attention. So he turned and went back into the house for his gun, but he was too scared to go back outside again. He slept that night with his gun propped up next to the bed, and the next morning he realized that Bandit had disappeared. The dog had still not shown up 2 days later when Partridge read in the newspaper about the sightings in Point Pleasant that same night. One statement that he read in the newspaper chilled him to the bone. Roger Scarberry, one of the members of the group who spotted the bird that night at the TNT plant, said that as they entered the city limits of Point Pleasant, they saw the body of a large dog lying on the side of the road. A few minutes later, on the way back out of town, the dog was gone. The police even stopped to look for the body, knowing Roger had mentioned that he passed it just a few minutes before. Partridge immediately thought of Bandit, who was never seen again. Between December 1966 and March 1967, at least 23 dogs vanished from the Point Pleasant area under mysterious circumstances. These weren't cases of pets wandering off. These were beloved family dogs, well-trained animals who knew their territories, disappearing without a trace from fenced yards, sometimes even from inside their homes. When the bodies were found, and they weren't always found, the condition was consistently disturbing. Dr. Michael Henderson, the local veterinarian, performed autopsies on 7 of the recovered animals at Mary's request. And his findings were clinical but chilling. Precise surgical incisions, complete blood drainage, and the removal of specific organs with what looked like medical precision using sophisticated instruments. Dr. Henderson had seen animals killed by predators and by cars and by disease, and this was something completely different. The cuts were too clean, too precise for any natural predator, and the complete absence of blood at the scene suggested the animals were either killed elsewhere and moved, or the blood was somehow drained. Neither explanation made much sense in rural West Virginia. But it wasn't just dogs. Farmers started finding cattle and sheep with the same precise incisions, the same evidence of blood drainage. For these working farms, this represented serious financial losses. Months of feed cost and future income, just gone. Law enforcement couldn't offer any explanations, and insurance companies faced with claims they couldn't categorize often refused to pay. And as winter deepened, things escalated. The strange lights that had been occasional sightings became almost nightly occurrences. Mary started keeping a detailed log of these aerial phenomena: times, weather conditions, directions of movement, number of witnesses. Her records showed 89 separate reports of unidentified lights over Point Pleasant between December 1966 and February 1967. These weren't distant points of light that could be dismissed as aircraft or planets. Witnesses consistently described large, pulsating orbs of red, orange, and white light that moved with impossible precision. They'd stop mid-flight, they'd change direction instantly, hover motionless for long periods, and accelerate to tremendous speeds. The lights seemed particularly drawn to the TNT area, but they were also spotted over the Ohio River, above residential neighborhoods, and along the major highways leading into town. And on December 14, 1966, exactly 1 year and 1 day before the Silver Bridge collapse, Mary herself witnessed something that convinced her all of this was real. She was driving home from a late council meeting when she saw what she later described as a formation of 7 lights moving in perfect synchronization over the water. She pulled over and watched for nearly 20 minutes as the lights performed maneuvers that defied every principle of aerodynamics she could imagine. They moved like they were connected by invisible wires, she wrote. When one turned, they all turned. When one stopped, they all stopped. But there was no sound, no exhaust, no visible means of propulsion. They were simply there, defying gravity and logic with equal ease. And then come the men in black. If the Mothman sightings were terrifying in their alien strangeness, the MIB encounters were disturbing in a completely different way. They violated social norms and human expectations. These weren't dramatic, obviously supernatural encounters. They were quiet, insidious intrusions that left witnesses feeling violated and watched. The men in black who showed up in Point Pleasant didn't all look the same, which, kind of somehow makes them even more unsettling. Some witnesses described them as unusually tall and pale, wearing perfectly pressed black suits that seemed oddly formal for rural West Virginia. And others reported shorter, darker-skinned individuals with these foreign accents and stilted speech patterns. But what remained consistent was their behavior. They'd appear at the homes of Mothman witnesses, usually within 24 to 48 hours of the sighting, claiming to be government investigators, journalists, or insurance adjusters. Connie Carpenter got a visit from two of these individuals just 3 days after her encounter. She told Mary, "They knocked on my door around 9 p.m. Two men in identical black suits, white shirts, thin black ties. They looked like they were dressed for a funeral, but their clothes were too perfect. No wrinkles, no wear, like they'd never even been worn before. They knew about my sighting before I told them, knew details I hadn't shared with anyone, not even my husband." The men's questions were deeply unsettling. They asked about her children, their ages, their school schedules, their daily routines. They wanted to know about her husband's work schedule and when the house was typically empty. And they asked if she had told anyone else about her sighting, if she had any photographs or physical evidence, and if she planned to speak with any more reporters. The strangest thing, Carpenter continued, was how they moved. They were very stiff, very formal, like they were concentrating on every gesture. And their skin, it was waxy, almost artificial looking. And when they shook my hand, their grip was ice cold and their skin just felt wrong, not quite human. Mary herself became a target, though her encounters took kind of a different form. Instead of visits, she received a series of phone calls from people claiming to represent various government agencies. These callers knew details about her investigation that she hadn't published, knew which witnesses she had interviewed and what they had told her, and they politely but firmly suggested that she stop reporting on the unusual events, hinting that continued coverage might be detrimental to public safety or interfere with ongoing federal investigations. When Mary tried to verify these claims by contacting the agencies the callers said they represented, she found no record of any investigations related to Point Pleasant. The FBI, the Air Force, the state police, none had any knowledge of the men who had been contacting her. It was as if they existed in some bureaucratic limbo, official enough to have access to sensitive information, but unofficial enough to leave no trace in government records. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the MIB phenomenon was their apparent interest in children. Multiple witnesses reported that these mysterious visitors asked detailed questions about local schools, about children's schedules and activities, and which families had young children and how they could be contacted. And this created this weird undercurrent of parental anxiety that added another layer of fear to an already terrified community. The cumulative effect of all these encounters, the electromagnetic disturbances, the animal disappearances, the unexplained lights, the visits from mysterious officials, was a community living in constant low-level terror. People started changing their daily routines, avoiding certain areas of town, keeping their children close, installing additional locks and security measures. The psychological pressure was immense, and it was building towards something that no one could predict or prepare for. By spring 1967, Point Pleasant had transformed from a quiet river town into something resembling a war zone. Armed citizen patrols were organized to search the TNT area, convinced they could confront and drive away whatever was terrorizing their community, and the searches found nothing, but they continued anyway. A desperate assertion of human agency in the face of something they couldn't understand. Local businesses began closing early, people avoided driving alone at night, children were kept indoors after dark, and schools instituted new safety protocols. And the tourism industry collapsed as word of strange events spread. Point Pleasant was becoming known as a place where impossible things happen and where the normal rules of reality seemed suspended. And through it all, Mary Hyre continued her methodical documentation, building a comprehensive record of a community under siege by forces that defied conventional explanation. What she was recording, though she didn't realize it yet, was a prelude, a town-wide preparation for something even more catastrophic than anyone could imagine. And that, everyone, is part 1 of the Mothman. This story is so big, it cannot be in one episode. There's even details of these encounters and things that I've talked about already that I didn't include because it's just so deep with information. So make sure to listen next week for part 2, where we go into the Silver Bridge collapse, more into the investigation. We get into John Keel, who was a big part of the Indrid Cold story, because he is a huge influential part of the Mothman story as well, and his experiences make Mary Hyre's seem like nothing. I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Like I said, I love the Mothman story. This has been one of my favorites ever since I was a kid, and I first saw the documentary called Eyes of the Mothman on Netflix back, probably 20 plus years ago. It was one of the best documentaries I ever watched on this, and it went into so much detail, including the Curse of Cornstalk and Indrid Cold and everything that happened with that. And so I really recommend checking that out as well, because that is a great documentary on this. I'm not sure if it's still on Netflix. I don't think it is, so I'm not sure where to find it. But if you can, it's definitely worth a watch. And if you like the show, please go on whatever podcast app you use, give us a rating, leave a review, share it with a friend. It'd be huge for expanding the show and reaching new audiences and growing the members of the Directive who allow me to do this podcast and just talk about all this weird shit that no one else wants to hear me talk about all the time. Check out the social medias, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, at Paranormal Directive 13. There's daily stuff on there. I put in some pictures of these stories and all that. And also check out the Patreon, patreon.com/Paranormal Directive 13. There are weekly Thursday minisodes on there for you guys to listen to for some smaller stories or, some creepypastas, things like that. Stuff that's not quite big enough to do a full episode on for the main podcast. And also send an email, paranormaldirective13@gmail.com. Tell me if you love the show. Tell me if you hate the show. Tell me if there's something that you want me to talk about on the show. And remember, guys, if you're driving through Point Pleasant, West Virginia, swing by the TNT area one night. See what you can find.